Welcome to Nusantara, the Southeast Asian archipelago. It is the birthplace of humanity, in our long journey of civilization. A homeland for human ancestors, for the last 1.5 million years. A place where our early ancestors have roamed a vast land of opportunity. Shared the space with many other wonderful creatures. Leave us the evidence of human evolution and their adaptation to the environment. Who are they? What do they look like? And how do they live their life? For almost 2 decades, the Center for Prehistory and Austronesian Studies has contributed to revealing the answers. Behind CPAS is a group of passionate scientists with global networking in prehistory and Austronesian studies. Our mission is to provide best practices in the framework of archaeological research and development. Pushing the values of our research beyond the knowledge. Reveals the national identity. Enriches our understanding of cultural developments. Unveil the reason behind our strong character of diversity. Narrates the story of ethnogenesis and the foundation of our nation state. Preserving our past as a heritage for the wealth of our future generation.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, our kind participant today. And we have arrived to the episode 32 of our talk show. And it is our great honor to have Professor Glenn Summerhayes today as a speaker for our 32nd talk show in this November. And I would like also to thank to Mbak Marlin Tolla. Selamat siang, Mbak Marlin, saya sedang dari jauh, to join us to have our talk show and our discussion about some recent updates regarding the Austronesian presence in the Papua Island. And maybe I will explain our introduction today in Indonesian. So, Bapak dan Ibu yang terhormat, terima kasih telah bergabung bersama kita di talk show pada siang hari ini, talk show ke-32. Dan kita sangat berbangga. We are very proud to have Professor Glenn Summerhayes, really famous researcher, really famous professor in world of archaeology, and also Mbak Marlin Tolla, a bright young scientist from Research Center for Archaeometry, National Research and Innovation Agency, Indonesia. And our discussion today, as I mentioned before, is about recent updates regarding the Austronesian presence in Papua Island. And before we enter the discussion, I would like to introduce you also to our participant here, that Professor Glenn Summerhayes biography. He's a professor in Pacific Archaeology, and he's now currently professor of anthropology at the University of Otago. if I'm not mistaken, since 2005. But before, he was previously the head of department of the Australian National University, NU, in archaeology and natural history. And in his career, he spent more than 4 decades undertaken extensive research in the long-term human history of the Asia-Pacific region, especially in the Melanesian region, with a prominent focus on Papua and Papua New Guinea. And his interest was in Pacific archaeology, in particular Melanesian archaeology, and then archaeology of trade and exchange, development of social complexity, and archaeology of East Asia, archaeometry, cultural heritage management, archaeology, and the school of curriculum in Papua New Guinea. And our closing remarks or concluding remarks will be present by Dr. Marlin Tolla. Marlin Tolla is researcher from Research Center for Archaeometry, our colleagues in Research Center in Organization for Archaeology, Language and Literature from under the National Research and Innovation Agency, and the Sulawesi Center for Archaeological Research. And her base currently is in Jayapura, Papua. And we are also very pleased to announce that she's already published as an editor of a book published by NU Press, by Australian National University Press, titled West New Guinea, a book published by NU, and then it's covering up the social, biological, and material history in regarding the Papua Island or the Western Papua New Guinea. And she published it as an editors in collaboration with 𝘊𝘗𝘆𝑇. And I would like also to express our sorry, and because Professor Truman Simanjuntak, he couldn't manage to join with us in for today's meeting because he's still in his trip to Northern Sumatra. And regarding our discussion today, the Papua and its surrounding island, actually, why we have interest to covering up the story about Papua and Austronesian presence is because the Papua become the center of very critical island for the early peopling of the Pacific region over maybe around 40 or 50,000 years ago when Homo sapiens moved to Africa. But we will talk more recently, but also with a connection also with the previous history in Papua. It's about the history of Papua about 3,000 years ago until 4,000 years ago, because between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, the Austronesian language began to enter Western New Guinea or Western Papua. And what happened during that time? That's why we invite you to discuss with the experts, Professor Glenn Summerhayes. Professor Glenn Summerhayes, the time is yours to present our public lecture, actually. And please, the time is yours.
Okay, can you see the PowerPoint?
Not yet, Professor.
Okay, I must do something then. I'll get back. There is a share screen. I've got the share screen. Now there's a button I must press to get the PowerPoint up and running. I've got the PowerPoint on my computer. It's just putting it up on the, well, we've got shared screen.
Maybe before you share your screen, maybe you start your PowerPoint, Professor.
Well, there's the PowerPoint. I've got the PowerPoint up on my computer.
And you have to look at the ribbon on below of your desktop, below of your screen, and there will be a zoom.
Yep, and which one do I press? I used to
share, the green one, share.
Yep, I've got share. Now, okay. You see it now?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Okay, I'm of the generation that we, up until 15 years ago, we used slides and giving lectures. PowerPoint is only a relative recent phenomenon for me. I think they came in when I moved to Otago 20 years ago to take up the chair of anthropology. So I'm still learning. I'm in Kyoto at the present. I'll be here for the next 4 months. I officially retire from my department in January. So this will be one of the last lectures I give as Professor of Anthropology. Thank you for inviting me here. It's basically an update on the archaeology of New Guinea. I would like to thank Truman, although he's not here. He asked me for to give a talk today. So if anything goes wrong, you can blame him. I'm sure it won't. Okay. Now, the aim today is to look at research undertaken on, well, the north coast of New Guinea. I want to talk about why, where, some case studies, and I want to look at the future of the archaeology, particularly the Austronesian movements of people into the Western Pacific. And of course, here, Indonesia, and particularly West Papua, plays a critical role. Now, I've been working for decades on what we call lepita. Lepita is the archaeological manifestation of those first footsteps of Austronesians into the Western Pacific. And I focused mainly on the Bismarck Archipelago. They're the islands to the east, New Britain, New Ireland, Manus. But recently, there has been a focus on mainland New Guinea to understand the social and economic phenomenon with the 4th and early 3rd millennium societies, in particular with lepita. Now, lepita origins has been argued for ages. The current models is that it developed out of East Asia, down through the Philippines into Indonesia, and then across the north coast of New Guinea. Another model has come out by Carson, Xiaoshunhong, Peter Bellwood, and myself, saying that although one direction may have been through Indonesia, there may also have been movements of people out into Micronesia coming in from the north. I should point out that no one is ever saying that one replaces the other, but there are multiple movements of people through both routes. It's a bit like if you look at making a cake, the ingredients of lepita comes from different directions, including Southeast Asia, Indonesia, where we know some of the domesticates came from, and possibly also through Micronesia, and the cake is baked in the Bismarck Archipelago. That's the best way of looking at it. But again, there are major gaps in our knowledge that I'll talk about later on. So these are models that we put forward to explain the Austronesian lepita phenomenon. The current model is that in the Western Pacific, we have Austronesian-speaking peoples with a material culture that we call lepita coming into the area to the east of New Guinea and the islands off mainland New Guinea. Around, I've got here 3,300, probably later actually, probably 3,200, 3,150. Every year things are changing. But you can get the picture. They're moving out into the remote Oceania, those islands to the east of the Solomons, soon after they arrived, and eventually populating Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa quite quickly over a few hundred years. And when they pushed into that Western Pacific, they took with them on their canoes their whole economy. They took with them domesticates, the pig, the dog, the chicken. They took with them their plants, the coconut, breadfruit, artocarpus, and so on. The settlements are found mostly on inert coastal environments. And I've got some images. I've got some more images later I think I'll put up here. In the Bismarck Archipelago, where I've been working for many, many decades, New Britain, New Ireland, Manus, there's a number of lepita sites being found, and I've been fortunate to work on a number of them. And it's been argued that the earliest lepita sites were found in this archipelago and then moved out into the Pacific. Here are some images of lapidar pottery. It's been argued that the pottery itself, about 25% of it, has these dentate stamps, designs. There's over 500, maybe 600 different motifs found from Papua New Guinea all the way out to Tonga and Samoa. Has been argued that these markings, these dentate stamps, are tattoos, social designs, tattoos on the pot. And indeed, on the bottom here, we have an image of a face with tattooing on the nose, the impression of the eyes, and encircle on the forehead. We have a potsherd on the right, which has another face on it, and these are quite common. But I've got to point something out. We're going to have to clarify this earlier on. Of all the ceramics we find in a lapidar assemblage, only about 25–30% are these dentate ceramics, and they're mostly bowls and stands or larger outcurving or carinated vessels. Most of the pottery we find are plain or linear in size, used for water and cooking. These dentate vessels are also manufactured differently. They're made using a slab construction technique, whereas the others are mostly coil and ring and very, very well made. So these dentate designs, which you see in the textbooks, too many people think that everything is dentate design. It's not. It's only a small component of the assemblage. And these are specialized vessels used probably for ritual or some social function. The other ceramics, those that are plain and those that are linear in size or notched or whatever, are probably utilitarian in function. So we have to make it clear that lapidar pottery is not all these pretty dentate designs. One of my students said to me, but why do you publish dentate designs in the textbooks? Well, you know, a publisher says you can only publish five images of a potsherd. You're going to put any plain ones up? You know, you put your best dentate designs up. But one shouldn't have the opinion or shouldn't have the idea that lapidar is all dentate. It is not. But dentate it is, and this dentate is exquisitely applied. This is the earliest lapidar pottery in the Bismarck archipelago. The image on the left looks like a computer-operated image. It indeed is around 3,150, 3,200 years old. And the one on the top right is part of a stand with a cutout. These stands are quite common all the way through East Asia and Southeast Asia and in the early lapidar assemblages. These are tattooings on pot, finely dentate and used on ceramics that are not cooking ware. They're not utilitarian. These are ceramics found from the Araway Islands. Oh, these previous ceramics, I should point out, are from the site of Kumgot off the islands of Ambitale, about 60 kilometers east of the southeast coast of New Ireland. I excavated these over a number of years from 1995 to about 2001, 2002. These ceramics were from the Araway Islands, mostly from the site of Advay, excavated with Chris Gosden, myself, Christina Pavlidis in 1989. Exquisite. These are identical to those that Patrick Kirch excavated from Talapaka Malai in Musau. A number of different vessels, shapes and sizes. These ones are from Emerau. Emerau is to the east of Musau. We'll talk about Emerau more in a minute. Some beautiful dentate ceramics. Again, these are the earliest dentate lapidar ceramics, around 3250. You notice the fishhook on the bottom right. This fishhook was found on Emerau. It's obviously never been used. The occupation was on a stilt village over a reef platform. The sea was 2 meters higher than it is today. So the occupation, the villages were on the stilt houses over the reefs. I can imagine someone making this out of trochus shell, and then all of a sudden someone sings out, they drop it in the water down into the sand. You've got no chance of finding it. How many times have you been to the beach and you drop something and you try and find it in the sand? Remote chances. What's interesting about the fishhook, as you probably noticed, is the barb on the end. It had been argued that barbs were not found in lepida assemblages. It had been argued that barbs were found in East Asia and Polynesia, but not in Melanesia. Well, the reason for that is that most of the fishhooks we find are broken. This one has never been used. And we've got an article coming out on this, hopefully early next year. So where are we? Well, the biggest changes in lepida archaeology is the finding of lepida pottery on the south coast of Papua New Guinea, around just west of Port Moresby. And you can see that here, that we've got pottery at Bogey 1 going back to 2900. 2900 is pretty much the same date as the occupation is occurring in Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. What we call middle to late lepida. Dog, chicken, the rat excellens, all came with people out into the Pacific on their canoes. They're all introduced species. Shell artifacts are varied and wide with different shells, whether they're conus or trochus shells used for the manufacture of artifacts. These are from the site of Kumgot, again, from Annia. You see these large coral bracelets. Catherine Szabo, who's in Cambridge now, she said that the implement on the top left may have been an earlier tattooing chisel that hadn't been finished. Well, I don't know about that, but again, a whole variety of shell artifacts found in these early assemblages, primarily because still villages, material falls down onto the reef. It's a low inert environment. It's not a high velocity environment, and then subsequent occupation with the sand covering it up preserves the site beautifully for future archaeologists. And of course, we also found shell adzes. Also, this beautiful shell adze on the top right, which came from the hinge of a Tridacna maxima, coral abraders, and of course, we have stone adzes as well. These are from, again, the early lepida sites. They're all of a similar size. They're quite small, heavily reduced. They're all, except for one, locally from local volcanics on the site of the island of Annia. And there's some more shell artifacts. The shell artifacts have been published. They were used by Catherine Szabo as part of her PhD when she was at the ANU, and they've been published in numerous journals and articles and books that have come out subsequently. And in the early lepida assemblages, we have obsidian. Obsidian, that black volcanic glass. We have a number of source areas in the Western Pacific, including Manos, the Admiralty Islands. West New Britain, we have 4 or 5 obsidian sources there. And there's a source down in the Ferguson Island, which came in later. And of course, this obsidian, we can source it using different techniques. We used to use a technique called proton-induced X-ray and gamma ray emission, PIXI-PIGMI, at the Lucas Heights Atomic Energy Commission in Sydney. But of course, now we have the portable XRF spectrometers. A lot of departments own their own. And with source material, which we have, we actually do our own sourcing in our labs at Otago Uni, as indeed does the ANU and Sydney University. Because each obsidian source has a separate fingerprint that you can distinguish them. We have obsidian from West New Britain going all the way out to Fiji by 3,100 and continuing to about 2,900. And indeed, we have obsidian from the Bismarck Archipelago going to northern Borneo. This is published by Peter Bellwood and Kuhn in Antiquity. We're not saying that people were depending on it, because you have your own obsidian sources in Southeast Asia. But the obsidian here would have been epiphenomenon secondary to other interaction occurring at that time. So we know there's interaction occurring between the Western Pacific and Southeast Asia. We're going to talk more about that later on. And of course, with the pottery, we can do chemical analysis. There are different techniques that one uses. Here is a photograph of a very young Glenn Summerhayes taken in 1979 when I still had black hair. It went grey soon afterwards. And I'm at Sydney University's electron microprobe the microprobe allows us to analyze the pottery and separate the minerals from the clays in doing the chemical signatures. And we construct models. And what the models tell us is that with the early lapita, people are using different clay sources with different fillers or tempers from different areas. And this is a result of movements of people over the landscape during the initial early exploration phase. In later lapita settlements, that is not the case. In later lapita settlements, we've got the classic standardized local production. A couple of pots might be moving, but the initial colonizing signature is completely different. So let's get back. Carson, Hung, Summerhayes, and Bellwood in the Journal of Island and Coastal Archaeology. What we suggested is that there were different pathways to the Bismarck Archipelago. One would have been through Southeast Asia along the north coast of New Guinea, and the other could have been from the Marianas down through Micronesia into the Bismarck Archipelago. It's an interesting hypothesis. Some have argued that they bypassed New Guinea altogether, and I don't believe that. So we have interesting times ahead. But therefore, we have to focus on that region that we don't know much about, the north coast of New Guinea, including Indonesia, Papua, north coast of Papua New Guinea. And it's critical in understanding and teasing out the movement of Austronesian speakers over 3,000 years ago. Well, where's the evidence of lapita on the north coast? We know it's on the south coast, and that's later in time. At the same time people are moving out into remote Oceania. On the north coast, there's only a few bits of evidence that we have. One is this pottery sherd we call the ᴊ𝘗𝘆 sherd. It was found by a guy called Lisk during the Second World War, and we don't know much about it, actually. It went to the South Australian Museum after Lisk had died. He was in the army. He was up there recording material. But all we know is that on the envelope that was found after he died, it had ᴊ𝘗𝘆 on it. We have a sherd by John Terrell and Rob Welsh, published in Antiquity. There's the sherd down here. I think we would say it's the lapita sherd that only a mother would love. That's a joke, by the way. And but it has dentate stamping on it. So what I wanted to do is we wanted to focus on exchange between New Guinea, what's happening on the mainland of New Guinea, and what's happening on the mainland interior of New Guinea. First, I want to look at definite exchange between mainland New Guinea and the Summerhayes group in northern New Ireland. This is the first demonstrated evidence of something actually moving from West Papua to lapita sites. This is a greenstone gouge, chisel. I found it on emerald. We did chemical analysis at Academia Sinica. It's jade. It's jadeite. Jadeite is very rare. The only jadeite source I knew was Japan and also the Burma-Chinese border. I spoke to the late Hugh Davies, who is the expert on PNG geology. He said that you get jadeite in some formations in Papua New Guinea, but it's microscopic. I then went through a Dutch journal from the 1890s, where a Dutch geologist had found greenstone around Lake Sentani. Now, we know you have a lot of nephrite in Lake Sentani, a lot of nephrite. But this isn't nephrite, this is jadeite. And I found a Dutch geologist had recorded a source in the Tavaria River. And in that source, he actually did wet chemistry on the greenstone. And the greenstone had exactly the same wet chemistry as the dry chemistry we had on this using the electron microscope. I then sent it to George Harlow at the Smithsonian Institute in America, who is probably one of the foremost world experts on jadeite and jade and nephrite. And we did more chemical analysis on it, and he confirmed that the source area was from west of Sentani, mainland New Guinea. Now, this article we published here doesn't go into detail about the sourcing directly to West Papua. We subsequently identified that, but it does come from west of Lake Sentani. So here it is. It's found with lapita pottery. It's found in 3,200-year-old contexts. It's identified as the first physical transfer of an object from mainland New Guinea, in this case, from West Papua, all the way across to lapita contexts. Problem we have is what's happening between this area and the rest of the lapita world. So now we know there's links. Now you must argue that there is interaction occurring between Sentani and the earliest lapita assemblages. This has been demonstrated now. The second example I want to give is the project I set up when I was in Canberra before I left to go to Otago. And I thought, well, if people did, if there's a fingerprint of Austronesians along the north coast of New Guinea, then we should see it on these islands just off the coast. And so I concentrated on an island called ᴘ괚, 60 kilometers off the north coast of from Wewak, which is the capital of East Sepik. Now, the reason I picked a smaller island is that, one, it's if you want to feel the pulse of movements, go to a small interaction island and you've got a better chance of finding material. And it's true, well, I went to all the other islands, but ᴘ괚 is the one that we concentrated on. When I was there, it was the third season that I was giving up, and I left, and the old chief told me about a footprint of an ancestor in the stone. We hear this quite often, but he was a good guy, and I went to see that foot, and all of a sudden, I noticed that there was this land underneath a cliff. And I said, but I thought this was water coming up towards the cliff. You've got gardens down here, not a big island. And so we climbed down the cliffs and we found this site, and the site's called Wairā. We put a series of excavations down from the beach into the cliff line, and we created sighting levels. We put a few excavations underneath the shelter, and down below we found there's different occupation layers. The top, I don't know, 1.2 meters occupation is the topsoil coming down from the top of the island. And that's dated to about 1,000 years ago, where you have a secondary movement of Austronesians back along the coast of New Guinea. But then there's another occupation level underneath the sterile level, and we radiocarbon dated that. By the way, I'd like to point out a couple of things. There's Tepsi Benny on the bottom left-hand corner. Tepsi worked with us. She used the assemblage and was the first Papua New Guinea female student to do her honours degree, BA honours in archaeology. She's now doing a PhD at a university in Queensland, the University of Western Queensland or Central Queensland, with Bryce Barker. And we did extensions out into the coast. I won't talk about those at the moment. But what the site's telling us, that we have occupation and pottery going back around 3,000, 3,100. So we do have pottery on the north coast at 3,100. The pottery has been rolled over into the site, then a sterile area, another rolling, but it's in situ going up. So we're looking at a planeware decorated material, and it has obsidian from not only Manus, but also West New Britain. This tells us these are not the first footsteps in this region. Now, just out of interest, there is a cave site on top of the island that we excavated, and we have evidence of seeds of plant remains going back around 12,000 years. So the island would have been a stopover island from the north coast of New Guinea going up to Manus, 200 kilometers away. So we have canarium nuts going back 12,000. We haven't published this yet, but hopefully in my retirement, we can publish it next year. This site of Wairā, I have not published yet. Hopefully next year when I'm retired and I have time on my hands. But it is an important site because we have got the footprints of humanity on this island off the north coast. And if it's on this island, it must be on the larger island of ᴊ𝘗 to the west. We did find that the excavations closer to the beach are much later in time as the sea went out and the landfill came through. This is the pottery, not exactly things to write home about, but the fact it's pottery and it's in stratigraphic levels, completely different depositional aspects compared to the lapita pottery in the Bismarcks, which are in low inert environments. These are in pretty rough environments, but pottery it is, and 3,000 years old it is. Okay. When I first looked at some of the pottery, it had calcareous inclusions. So I said, well, ᴘᴚ is a calcareous island. It's a limestone island. But I sent it to the late Bill Dickinson, who was the expert on thin sections on Pacific pottery. And he noticed terrigenous sands. He said, this is not from ᴘᴚ. If it has terrigenous sands in it, it's not from ᴘᴚ. So I got Bill to check the ᴘᴬᴂ material, the Manus material, the Wewak material, the Bismarck Archipelago Islands, nothing. Doesn't match any of it. So I said to Bill, where could it have been made from? He said, anywhere from the mainland all the way across to the west coast of Papua. But there's nothing to compare it with across the border. Nothing. So this gives us insights into what we don't know. Okay. Obsidian from the earliest levels. No matter which way you look at it, we have early pottery from mainland New Guinea going back 3,000 years, found with an already existent exchange network. This is a photograph I took. This is the late ᴘᴘᴅᴜ, who I worked with for many years, Chief Matthew Boyack, myself, and the late one of my students who passed away. I should have put the photograph in. I forgot that it was there. But a great team to work with. Pei-Wai Wu did her PhD thesis on lapita pottery. She went back to Taiwan and got a job, but unfortunately died of cancer soon afterwards. Now, I want to say one thing about archaeology. Archaeology is not just digging sites. As it turned out, the year before I was there, they were forming a soccer team. So I bought the soccer team their jerseys, and I became the official manager of the One-Up Soccer League. See the cup they have below? I'd love to say they won a match, but they didn't. They just had a trophy without playing any games. But so archaeologists also have different roles in society, and here I am as a soccer manager. Okay. The third example I want to talk about is mainland New Guinea. And we know that there has been arguments for pottery much earlier around the inland sea of the Sepik. Now, the Sepik River, the river today, was once a large inland sea. And we know that in that inland sea, pottery came into that region and came up to the interior of New Guinea. We know this because of the site of ᴘᴜᴜ. ᴘᴜᴜ has pottery that Sue Bulmer had published as being 3,000. She thought it might have been a bit earlier. We've been to ᴘᴜᴜ. We reanalyzed Sue's pottery and her charcoal dates. And Dylan, who was a student of mine at the time, took the lead in the paper and published it in PNAS. We did geochemical sourcing of the pottery by the scanning electron microscope. We also have a portable scanning electron microscope in my department, which is great for students. And we confirmed that the pottery came from different regions. Some of it came from the coast. Some of it came from the interior. And the interior would have been at the edge of the inland sea. Now, if this is the case, then we have ceramics coming up to ᴘᴜᴜ at 2,900, 3,000 years ago, being made locally from the inland sea on mainland New Guinea. This is how the pottery is coming up. The paper that was published in +1, evidence of Austronesian influences in highland environments at around 3,000 years ago. But we have other evidence that we haven't published. And the articles they've been written, but I have to polish them off. One is called the 꽊𝘗 rock shoulder. It's near Timbunki. It's in the Sepik River region. And just to be quite quick summary, 𝘊𝘗𝘆𝘂 excavated the site about 30 years ago. We re-excavated it with Andrew Fairburn. I was working up on the WEWAC. Andrew and the late Jeff Hope went down to Timbuktu. They excavated it, radiocarbon dated the material to 2,800, 2,900. We subsequently looked at the pottery, looked at it under thin section and chemical analysis, and it comes from the same inland source as the 꽊𝘶𝘆 material on that inland sea. The other example that we haven't published yet, this is all recent material, is a site just to the east of 꽊𝘶𝘆, a site called Munap Camp in the Simbai Valley, the valley to the east. It's a project that I had with Ben Shaw and Judy Field, and looking at those links between the coast and the interior. And we excavated the site of Munap Camp. The pottery here is dated to 2,900. We've mentioned it in this article in Australian Archaeology of the date of the site and the fact that pottery was found. We have to write up the article of the extensive analysis of the pottery, and hopefully that'll be done next year. We also found other material in the highlands of New Guinea of the early Neolithic, going back even earlier. Okay, this is the Simbai Valley and the Korong Valley to the west. Here's Munap Camp. It's basically a large limestone outcrop. Okay, the inland sea of the Sepik would have been quite extensive. What I'm getting here is that in the past, in the past it was thought that pottery coming into the interior was a long way from the coast. But we now know that it wasn't. Because of the inland sea, it would have only been 1 or 2 days trade into the interior. And we're only looking at 1 or 2 pieces. We're not looking at the hundreds of thousands of pieces we're getting from a lapita site. We're looking at trade of this plainware pottery coming from the inland sea. Well, if it's been made on the coast of the inland sea, the next step, therefore, is to go and try and find evidence of the inland sea down by the coast. And that's what we've been trying to do. Currently, we've been working in Madang and north of Madang. There's Dylan, by the way, Dylan in the back with the red hair. It's a long time ago. He worked on Bilbil Island, looking at trade networks in the last 500 or 600 years. We worked on Kaka with one of our PNG students, Kenneth Miamba, who just finished his master's, first-class honours. He's back now in Port Moresby, hopefully to do a PhD in Canberra. There's Kenneth, who had finished his master's by research. And what we're trying to do in the north is to link the coast to the mountains, this coastal region here, up into the interior. So we had field projects up in the Ramu River. There's myself and Ben Shaw. There's the Ramu River, about 50, 60 kilometres inland. We excavated on the coast with Loretta Hassel from the National Museum. Loretta's doing her PhD with us at Otago. On the right, you can see Dr. Roxanne Sang, another Papua New Guinea archaeologist who completed her PhD on the rock art of Papua New Guinea. She did it from a university in Brisbane. This site here goes back about 500 years. But then what we wanted to do is we actually went further into the Ramu area. And although I can't go into detail because the results are just known, I was up there with Loretta at Ann Ford and Ben Shaw and Kenneth Miamba in June and July. We re-excavated some of the sites in the Ramu where Pamela Swadling had worked about 30 or 40 years ago. And we've confirmed that we have occupation, pottery occupation, going back at least 2,000 years ago. But that's still in the early stages. Now, before I finish this talk, I just want to point out we have a large gap in our knowledge, and it starts at the border of West Papua and Papua New Guinea, and it goes all the way across. We know nothing. There, of course, is interaction between that north coast and lepidolite assemblages to the east. We know this with the evidence of the greenstone jadeite chisel or gouge that definitely came from west of Sentani. We know this. The pottery that we're finding must have relationship to some of the offshore islands. If this is the route that people took, more attention should be focused on that route for the younger archaeologists to look at, to actually fill in the links between Southeast Asia and the Bismarck Archipelago. Before I go, if I've just got a couple of minutes, we tend to look at the earliest and the earliest spread. We should point out that when people settled these islands, they didn't stop moving. You know, Polynesians went to South America and came back again. And also people from Melanesia also had interaction to the area to the north. And what I want to do is I want to have a quick look at the next few minutes of the island of ʻEmerauw that I worked. I went there because of lepidolite archaeology. It's a great place to go to. It's in a remote area next to the island of Musau. There's ʻEmerauw to the right. We found a lot of lepidolite sites, had a great time, but we also found something that was an enigma. We found these stone structures. These stone structures are not found in New Guinea. They're not found in the Pacific. We do have, sorry, Melanesia. We have similar ones in the Solomons, but they're not the same. The closest that we have of these stone structures, and ʻEmerauw is full of these stone structures. The only ones we have similar to are in the Micronesian islands to the north, in particular Yap. And I've been looking at links between New Guinea and Micronesia extensively. I've been looking at the German Südsee expedition reports, where the islands of southern Palau had extensive interactions with the communities of Papua, Indonesia, and Southeast Asia, Indonesia. Two-way interactions, raids going to the north, people trading to the south. But we also have links between Papua New Guinea and areas of Micronesia in the past. Obsidian from Manus is found in Ponape. This is knowledge that's been lost in by recent people, but the interaction is there. Working in Manus at a place called Rambucho, they have a poem about people moving to the north, an island called Yap, of whiter-skinned people then coming back. Now, Yap is a German term for the island, so it's a modern construct. But they still have this poem. I think it means paddle. They still had this poem of links to the north. What I'd like to do in the future is have a look at these links between New Guinea and the north. And the reason is that a lot of Melanesian genes are found in Palau, Yap, ʻEmerauw, and I want to have a look at those prehistoric links between those islands for the last 1,000 years, and indeed the links they have with Southeast Asia. So we're all focused on the earliest and the best. But as I said, people never stop moving around the landscape, and I'm keen to explore those links where the written record was never recorded. This is before the Spanish arrived in the Pacific. Oral histories finished 100 years ago. This is pre-oral histories. But we know indeed that people moved around, particularly when you find obsidian sourced to Manus going as far as Ponape. Well, we've got type X pottery from Yap. They argue it comes from, it was found in Papua New Guinea. We've got obsidian moving around. We've got Austronesians moving themselves all over the Western Pacific. When do we have time to do future work? But I do want to say that if we're going to actually concentrate on a list of priorities of what should we do now, I do think that the north coast of Papua is a high priority, and that's been recognized for the last 50 years. And that's something that younger archaeologists from Indonesia will have to address to try and link the Western Pacific with Southeast Asia. Now, on that note, I'd like to thank a number of organizations and also to Truman for inviting me. I hope the lecture was satisfactory. and I hope that it raises some discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Glenn. It was a beautiful presentation and was really crystal clear about the story about the population, the peopling of the Western of the Eastern New Guinea. And before we enter to our discussion, I would like also to emphasize, because this is important for I saw that some of our participants are student and also young archaeologists, that it was beautiful when you say that you're working with the communities. And I would like also to emphasize what Professor Glenn Summerhayes said, that as an archaeologist, we respect the fact that our research is people history and identity. And that's the best, the most important for us, because we work in the community and we respect the community, respect our material culture. We study it as someone's history, as someone's identity. And it's really, really nice principle for working in archaeology. And we are entering the session for discussion, for further discussion. If there's any question, you can use raise hand feature, or you can just open mic and say that you want to address a question to Professor Glenn, or you can type it in the chat room. And I would like also to invite our participant in YouTube. You can also type in YouTube live stream, you can also type your question, and we will read it and we will discuss it with Professor Glenn. And just waiting for any question about the yes, you can, please, you can, Mr. Ari Vanuaranu, you can turn on your mic.
All right, selamat siang, Dr. Ruly.
Selamat siang, Mas Ari.
Professor Summerhayes, Dr. Tolla, everyone. Yeah, your presentation was fascinating, especially like the maps illustrating events from thousands of years ago. Like, I find it very romantic, you know, to think about like all these events happening way before our time. But of course, the image that stood out for me was the professor with the soccer team posing with the trophy that they didn't win actually. So yeah, I joined this webinar with little background on the topic as a layman who knows nothing about archaeology. But I did read a little bit about Austronesian speakers in the provinces of West and Southwest Papua, right? Particularly the pottery tradition that they have over there, which we call gerabah abar, if I'm not mistaken, kalau nggak salah ya. However, the pottery is not as ornate, kan ya, as the pieces from mainland Papua New Guinea. I've learned today the term dentate stamping that you see in Papua New Guinea. So I was wondering why do on our side it lacks the dentate stamping. Well, excuse my ignorance, but why did the Austronesian speaking people remain in the coastal areas of the island and never venture into the interior, right? I'm curious about how closely related the Austronesian languages on the Indonesian side to those on the Papua New Guinean side, given the great distance between them. I guess that's it. Thank you in advance. I'm sorry if this question doesn't really directly relate to what you were discussing. I don't really know, like nggak terlalu ngerti sama itunya topik. Thank you.
Okay, that's a very good question, and thank you for the comment about the football side. Working with communities is extremely important. I'm working on their land, and if we don't put the work back in the community and work with them, then why are we there in many ways? Dentate stamping is interesting. It's only found in the early lapita pottery. After the early lapita pottery moves away, it stopped. Now, there are theories for this. And one theory that I like to develop is that the dentate stamping is only found on the earliest, it's on lapita pottery. So all the way across from the islands of New Guinea, all the way across to Samoa. Over time, it changes. It becomes less ornate, less complicated. And it's only found on this social wear. It's not utilitarian. It's not for cooking. So let's look at this. If they're social signifiers, if these designs, there's over 600 designs that are found throughout the Western Pacific, if they're social signifiers, they're signifying who people are. Now, you've got to remember that on mainland New Guinea, you know, west and east, people have been there for 50,000 years. The work that I did up in the Ivani Valley shows people there by at least 49,000 years, probably earlier. So mainland New Guinea was populated. So the Austronesians coming along the coast were entering an area that had been populated for, 40-odd thousand years. And so they're found on the offshore islands, probably where no one lived or they were able to settle there. One could argue that if they came to mainland New Guinea in the initial colonization, they may not have lasted very long. Now, having said that, if you're living with people that, if you're the other, so to speak, the anthropological other, then you have these social forms of identification, social signifiers. When you move out into the Western Pacific, when you go to remote Oceania, in remote Oceania, east of the Solomons, you're the first people there. No one's there. No one's there at all. New Oceania, 50,000 years. Remote Oceania, your footsteps in the Pacific are the first footsteps. So when you're having these social designs on your pottery, who are you signaling? You're not signaling anybody. So over time, those designs basically change and disappear. Back in mainland New Guinea, where dentate pottery is there for at least 1,000 years, you're still signaling your community against the other, and therefore the dentate stays longer. But by 2,200 years, it completely disappears anyway. So a dentate doesn't last for long. As far as language is concerned, I tell my students in New Zealand that we talk about the origins of peoples and we talk about archaeology. And I mean, I went through Sydney University and through an anthropology department, and we were studying prehistory. And all that means is history before the written record. And so we used archaeology, linguistics, biological anthropology, anything we can get our hands on to create a history of the past. Linguistics plays a critical role in this. So I say to my students in New Zealand, I've been there 20 years. It's a beautiful place. My daughter grew up there, and my daughter, when she went to school, she learned 2 of the 3 languages of New Guinea. One is English, one is sign language. The third one is Te Reo, Maori. And so a lot of the kids at school and at university understand some basics of Te Reo. So I say to them, what's the word for 2 in Maori? 2. And they say rua. What's the word for I in Maori? They say mata or meta. The word for I on Coil Island is meta. The word for 2 on Coil Island off the north coast of New Guinea is rua. And I go through all the islands of the Pacific and the Indian Ocean that are Austronesian, and they have the same or similar words, which demonstrates a common ancestry coming through. The question I have is, we have a common ancestry. We're having this incredibly complex ceramic manufacture of these social signifying pottery used for probably ritual. Then where do we find it in other parts to the west? And this is where the north coast of New Guinea holds the answer to those footsteps. So your question is a very good one, and thank you for asking it.
Thank you very much, Professor Glenn. Pak Ari, mungkin ada yang mau ingin ditambahkan, Pak Ari? Silakan, if you have any additional comments or additional question, if you may.
Enggak sih, nggak terlalu ngerti soalnya. Tapi, well, thank you. I find your statement that your steps are the very first steps. I think that's a very powerful statement, and that is such an important moment in our collective history. Thank you, Professor.
And maybe is there any other question, or maybe I would like, as I mentioned before, we are in a talk show. I would like to also invite Marlin. Maybe you have some insight or new information regarding the connection between the coastal and inland in Papua for the recent years.
Hello, Professor Glenn. My name is Marlin, and thank you everyone that's already attended this. Is that my voice is?
Yes. Yeah, we can.
One thing is actually I learned. I tried to. That's about the pottery, Professor. Which is actually we already about almost 15 years working here in local archaeological research center in Jayapura. But one interesting part that I know that from the style and other things from this lapita is really hard to find, especially in the northern coast of Papua. That's made me a little bit wondering why I keep wondering until today, why we didn't found it this one. And so when we are just open for doing or something like excavation in some of this area, especially in Sentani and also the northern coast. We are just something like when we are this kind of disappointed that we did never find this kind of, but of course, again, this is something like a stupid thing. I mean, every kind of, I really totally understand that. I mean, even that there no lapita, but even that not only no sign or no style at all, it is also data. So, but I just keep wondering why there is, and even today, sometimes I just little bit check our artifacts room, and then I just find something like looking around. There is no lapita at all. There's no motives of this, and then but what we found is really like interesting to. This interesting part is about this obsidian also. This is really hard to find here in the northern coast. And also, but the most important one is in cells, this something like a jewelry and also bracelet is often found. But I don't know, my colleague, it seems like I just put it only in this something like our report, only report, and then never been going through the international journals. So it's also the one really big homework for us that working in Papua, in western part of Papua. And also, Professor, maybe some, and also look, you maybe I need to some. Actually, we have also a few potteries, but it's quite difficult for me because I try to learn about this pottery, but until today, it's difficult also for me. And this about this distribution of this pottery is also found in the highland of Papua. It was found in the bird-head of Papua. It's nearby. The name is Ayamaru, nearby this. What is this lakes? One of these. I think it's 2,500 meter from sea level. So it's quite. It's quite. It's part of the highland, and then it's. But the interesting part is I was a little bit wondering why this pottery is coming here. But there is no international journal and about this, and only report. And it's really, this also in our homework in Papua, West Papua. But again, there's no style at all and other things, but seems like mostly used for cooking and other things. So yeah, that's all that I want to say about this lapita and other things. And also interesting part, it's about from the maybe was also questioned by Mr. Ari it's about what is this? The tradition, that sleeping tradition that's still do by these people in, the name is Abad. Yeah, it's quite, I and also Dylan and I and also other friends from was in last September, I think. We visit this island and we just a little bit see how they work on these potteries. And so according to Dylan, he said that similar to what people do in Papua New Guinea. I think in, I don't know, where is the sleeping? I forgot one of the sleeping tradition pottery is making in Papua New Guinea. So, and so that my little bit, I mean, a lot of questions actually coming from this pottery. And yeah, so for us in Western part, Professor, really like really not to like really how to say this one. So many big questions still need to be in our homework here, and yeah. So that's all that I want to say for now. So thank you, Professor.
I'll just make a couple of comments. The pottery that you see on the screen is from the ᴊ𝘗𝘭𝘪 area. Now, I should point out I've been very privileged and lucky to excavate a number of lapida sites. But lapida sites in New Guinea, the islands, are extremely rare. This site here, the photograph of the pottery is from the side of Advait. It's a land spit. And on that land spit, you walk down the land spit, you'll find no pottery on it whatsoever. And indeed, the first meter, there was nothing whatsoever. And then after a meter, we hit this concrete-like layer where the fresh water is hitting the salt water and it's forming a concrete. And below it, we have what's called a 𝘗𝘗𝘭𝘪𝘯𝘀 freshwater lens. But Chris Gosden put down 15 test pits from one end of the spit down to the other. And in the third last test pit is when we found the pottery. From a surface survey, you would never have seen it. On Koyo, from the surface survey, you would never have seen it. From Kumgot, I'd love to say I found the pottery through fantastic archaeological survey techniques and whatever. I didn't. One of the local men who I spoke to a year earlier listened to a talk I was giving about pottery and community, they can help us. And a year later, I came back and he called me over and he said, I was trying to dig a well for water. I couldn't find water, but I found these. And he had a plastic rice bag. And I pulled out the pottery. It was early lapida pottery. I said, crikey, where'd you find these? We speak Tok Pisin in New Guinea. You'll find them long way. And he said, oh, over here. And he showed us the site. I would never have found it. So a lot of we have an expression, is absence of evidence, evidence of absence? The question is no. It could still be there, but you've got to find it. I find the community is incredibly helpful. Kids going with their parents doing the gardening, or sometimes you just you might find something and you think, okay, we're going to put 15 test pits down and just excavate them. It's really hard. It's really hard. On mainland north coast of New Guinea, we're not finding anything. We have local pottery, of course. People are making local ceramics. It's on the islands that we're finding the material. And again, it's really hard. On the south coast of New Guinea, you have pottery making up until today. In fact, I think one of your colleagues, I haven't seen her in 30 years, Karina Arafin, she did her master's on pottery from Motu. And the Motu people still make pottery. But the lapida pottery found in that west of that area, next to Moresby, was only found when ExxonMobil were building a large gas container for their gas coming down from the highlands, that they got a group of archaeologists from Monash University to excavate the area to see that there was no, by law they have to do it. And to their total surprise, they're digging in the ground, they found lapida pottery. No one had ever thought of it there. It was never on the surface. So a lot of the pottery, it is difficult to find. I've been lucky. I've been blessed that I've been able to work on so many lapida sites. but it is luck, it is community, it's going back time and time again, and it's a sixth sense really. But I've got to say, a number of them has just been pure lucky. But again, that's the way we find lapita pottery. So I feel for you, because I've been there. I've been in those situations where you spent like a whole season looking for something, and you're going, it must be here somewhere. But the mainland is always difficult. The other thing we do too is, I'm sure you do it, is there's a thing we call in ⴘᴑᴜᴜ, it's 𝘊𝘂𴑐 understand the geomorphological processes leading to the landscape you see today. So on many islands, for instance, lapita sites are found 0.5 kilometer inland, but that was once a bay 3,000 years ago. So we try and do a coastal reconstruction of what the environment looked like. On the north coast of New Guinea, unfortunately, where I work, it's a high energy environment, extremely high energy. Unlike in the Bismarck archipelagos, where you have these low inert environments where, you get a beautiful reef system offshore with the waves coming over, and you can actually have a stilt house in both the two wind seasons won't affect you. On the north coast of New Guinea, it's like a war zone. There's no reefs out there. You've got the sea pounding down. It's a different environment altogether to look at. It is difficult. So I empathize. I have empathy for you. I've been there, done that. Hopefully one day it's just pure luck and community guidance. I'm sure it's there somewhere. But stick on the islands offshore. That's where you're going to find something. Do you find any obsidian at all on the islands offshore?
Sorry, Professor?
Do you find any obsidian?
Obsidian, yeah, that's true. It's actually around like Sentani, but it's not too much. A really small thing. Yes, something like the tiny, like this.
Have you sourced it at all?
Yeah, the color actually, it's just few things, but it's really hard to find also. But bracelet from shells and jewelry is really often found it in this area. Yeah.
I find it exciting. I think you're in an exciting area.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree, because obsidian, it will be interesting to do research furthermore, because as long as I remember, there are no really good quaternary volcanic deposit in Papua, right?
Yeah.
Well, we're getting obsidian from Manos all the way up to the border, Vanamo and Idapae. And the further from the source, you expect it to be smaller if it's down the line exchange. If it's larger, it'd be direct procurement. So a technological analysis, even if it's small, is extremely important.
Yes, because it's really sharp and it's logic, like Professor Glenn said, that it will be interesting because getting farther from the source, becoming smaller, becoming exotic, I think, like Professor Glenn.
Yeah.
And as long as remember, back again, no quaternary volcanic deposit contains obsidian in Papua, and obsidian is really brittle, and it's really easy to weather. That's why we only get it from the young volcano by Marlin. I believe that, I believe that your research on, if you are more focused on obsidian, I would like to join the research if you have, because I'm working with obsidian also, Professor Glenn. And we have another question, quite interesting, but maybe we have to elaborate a little bit. A question from Indrajaya Sambodo, maybe he's a geologist. And his question, apparently, it's is there any geologists within the team? Of course, I believe that there are. And geologically, Australia and most eastern of Indonesia was one of big, massive landmass. Here, he said that during the Jurassic period, and we will elaborate a little bit that we know that archaeologically we have some evidence from 50, like Professor Glenn said, that around 50 or 40,000 years ago, before the came of the Austronesian. And what do you have any evidence? I will elaborate the question. Do you have any evidence of strong relationship between the indigenous of like the the people, pre-Austronesian community living in this island, and the Austronesian newcomers to the island? Do you have any good example about the contact between them, Professor Glenn?
Well, people have been on mainland New Guinea for 49, 50,000 years, and New Guinea and Australia were joined for 80% of human history. They only separated 10,000 years ago. So for 40,000 years, it was one landmass, including Tasmania. And the evidence we have is from the ᴊ𝘗𝘂 Valley in the mountains of Papua. And I published that in 2010 in the journal Science. So the second thing is we work with geologists all the time. We need geological geologists to be with us. And I'll give you an example. We're looking at pottery, thin sections, and also pottery chemical analysis. Now I can pull out a geology map and compare it with a local geology and make an assessment. But a proper trained geologist looks at it and sees much more information and data by the rock configurations and so on. So we would be walking blind if we did not have a geologist interpreting the results that we had. If not in the field, then at least bringing our results to them to corroborate what we think and getting their opinion. We're very lucky at Otago University. We have a very good geology department, and we were very lucky in the University of Papua New Guinea having the late Hugh Davies. Hugh Davies was an Australian who did his PhD at Stanford in California in America. He could have gone anywhere in the world, but he went to Papua New Guinea and he loved the place. He spent most of his life there. He retired recently in his late 80s and died only earlier this year. He wrote most of the geological maps, and he was well respected by all geologists working in the world and that region. So he was my mentor. He's the one who provided really important information. Bill Dickinson, one of the world's most famous geologists on tectonics, to him, he looked at our thin sections. He wrote a book on it, on thin sections in archaeology in the Pacific. But to Bill, it was a hobby. His real work was hardcore geology. But again, we had to rely on these people because their knowledge was just fantastic and gave us guidance as to what we can say and what we couldn't say. So we have people living in Papua New Guinea for 50,000 years. At 3,000 years, you have Austronesian movements coming, people living off the coast, away from the mainland, and over the next 1,000 years, slowly moving on to coastal regions, interacting. A classic example is around Port Moresby today, where you have Motu populations who are Austronesian, been in the South Coast for about 1,000 years, and they interact with the local ꘗ₃ and ꘗ₃ peoples into marrying and trade links. On the coastal area of the south coast of New Guinea, particularly during the dry season, people have to rely on trade to exist, not only along the coast, but within the interior. So I think that Austronesians and non-Austronesians had a lot to offer each other, particularly in times of need in trade and exchange. And we see this today. The fact is the coastal areas of New Guinea are all pretty much Austronesian, and they interact and marry. I mean, the world's different today. They all marry. They go to high schools together and interact and live together. On New Ireland, there's only one non-Austronesian language. Most of it's Austronesian. On New Britain, it's mostly Austronesian, but there are still a handful of non-Austronesian languages. On Kaka Island, which I had an image of Kenneth Miamba working for his masters. Now, picture this. Half the island is Austronesian. The other half of the island is non-Austronesian. They speak two separate languages. Material culture exactly the same. The high school, exactly the same. The women and men move between the regions. It's matrilineal, matrilocal. So you can move into an Austronesian area and then you have to start speaking Austronesian. And if you went to a non-Austronesian area, the male would then speak non-Austronesian. Genetically, there's no difference between them. The difference is in their social structure and their social men's house structure, which I think is really important. So there's many examples of people moving in together. Today, in 2024, they're all, the Austronesian, non-Austronesian divide really doesn't exist. Their first priority is to the local community, their local languages, of which there are 900 in Papua New Guinea. But by and large, they're all Papua New Guineans, no matter how long they've been in the country for. And that's really summarizes what PNG is today. But their first, if they're going to distinguish themselves, it'd be on their language group, but not non-Austronesian against non-Austronesians. It's basically language. And if they're overseas in Australia or I'm sure Indonesia or Europe, they're all Papua New Guineans, the old one-talk system. So, yeah, I don't think people even think about Austronesians and non-Austronesians today. It's all about languages, but language groups, so the 900 languages. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it's really fascinating, your idea and the elaboration for the question. Thank you very much. And maybe because I saw one of our colleagues, Mas Hari, already raised his hand.
Yeah.
We can proceed. Mas Hari. Okay.
Yes. Okay. Can you hear my voice?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mas Ruly, and hello, Prof. Glenn. My name is Hari. I'm actually I study about metals, so it's quite interesting about your presentation about lapita and what is the movement to the Papua. I have a question about the metals. Do you have any idea when actually the metal is present in Papua, and because it's not really clear actually as for the metals. And do you have any idea with that when it's present in Papua? And my second question is about the Austronesia. Do you have any idea why in Australia we don't have any evidence of the Austronesia culture? Thank you. Only two.
Okay. To your first question, let's separate Indonesian Papua from Papua New Guinea. In Papua New Guinea, there is only one example of metal. One. That was in Manus on Low Island. Manus, M-A-N-U-S. An article by Wal Ambrose, A-M-B-R-O-S-E, in the journal Antiquity, found a small bit of bronze, about this big. It wasn't big. It was very small, eroded underneath a 2,000-year-old volcanic ash. It is the only example of metal. The Metal Age never reached the Western Pacific. In West Papua, Papua and Indonesia, I'm not an expert on this, but I do know that you get metal from probably the Metal Age, probably over 2,000 years, probably longer, particularly with the distribution of Hager drums out of Vietnam during the late Han period, the Chinese Han period, into northern Vietnam. There's been a movement of merchants out of northern Vietnam with the Hager drums found out throughout the islands of Southeast Asia. I believe some have been found in Indonesian Papua, and you do get early metal there. I think metal has been found around Lake Sentani. Difficult to date, but some are similar to material found off Timor. But I'm not an expert on that. But in in Papua New Guinea and the Western Pacific, one example of metal, 2,000 years old, and that's it. You might get metal later on, but no, not in archaeology.
Okay. So thank you so much. This was very useful information for about the eastern part of the Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. This one.
And what was your other question?
as any evidence of the presence of the Austronesia in Australia?
Okay. Most of Australia was separated when the Austronesians came through. There is evidence of ceramics found off Lizard Island. This was published recently in, oh boy, what was the journal? I should know, I was an author on the paper. Quaternary Studies, I think, or Quaternary Reviews. But there was pottery found in 2,400 geol contexts, and these would had to have been made by people coming down from the Papuan coast, the South Papuan coast of New Guinea, coming down. Trade and exchange was going all the way through from Papua New Guinea down through the Torres Straits, down into the northern part of Queensland. As far as other areas are concerned, we do know that moccasins from Indonesia came down and traded with Australia. You know, one of the problems we have is people didn't write things down. And so we do find archaeological evidence of these movements in Indigenous Australian, Aboriginal Australian history. They're quite clear that they traded, exchanged, genetic exchange as well. So we do know there's interaction with moccasins, probably only in the last few hundred years, but who knows, perhaps even further. But no Austronesian populations, speaking populations, on the mainland of New Guinea.
Let's see. Okay. Thank you so much, Prof. Glenn.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question, please?
Oh, Karina, how are you?
Yes, please, Bu Karina.
Hi, Glenn. I just want to say hello to you.
It's been a
It's
long
been
time.
More than 25 years, I think.
It is. Yeah, how are you going?
Good. Okay. I'm also retired early next year. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just turned 70 last week. So
Wow.
it's about time I've got to retire. I'm getting too old. I'm having an operation. I'm here in Kyoto in Japan. So I'm getting a foot operation. I've got osteoarthritis. So they're going to, age catches up. But you haven't changed a bit, by the way.
Well, more gray hair.
Oh, yeah, look at this. Mind you, I had gray hair when I knew you, so.
Yeah, I just want to ask you, thank you for the update, because I'm not really follow up the Pacific archaeology, but when we talk about pottery, lapita pottery, it's always the dentate stem. But how about the plain pottery? Are they also distributed as wide as the dentate stem? And because it's easy to identify the dentate stem as lapita, but how about the plain pottery? And I just wonder whether in the Micronesia there is an evidence or more evidence about the influence of lapita pottery, or not at all, because it seems the route is through the Micronesia rather than to the mainland.
Yeah. Well, firstly, the plain pottery doesn't change much at all. So when you have dentate and the dentate designs and forms changing, plain pottery remains pretty much the same. Indeed, when you look at, say, Vanuatu, and people talk about lapita disappearing and new forms of pottery appear, in actual fact, the dentate drops out, but the vessel forms remain exactly the same. The planeware is exactly the same. And you get other forms with decoration on exactly the same planeware pots. So in many ways, there's a continuity. And if I found a planeware pot, look, if I found a dentate stamp pot, I can guess the age by looking at the design, and I'd be pretty accurate with ballpark figures. If I found the plain pot, I wouldn't have a clue. And it's because it's a utilitarian pot. Perhaps if I did chemical analysis or whatever, that's on the surface. If it's excavated, of course, it's different. But no, plain pottery pretty much is utilitarian. It's pretty much similar throughout many thousands of years. In New Guinea, however, it drops out. In New Guinea, after 2,000 years ago, pottery, as you know, pottery is only made in the islands in Manus and Buka. And on mainland New Guinea, it does take up there, including non-Austronesian communities making pottery, but a whole lot of variety there. We just found that we found a village up north of Madang last year, and we excavated it. It comes to about 500 years old. The pottery, we've never seen it before. And then this year, up on the Rabu, we went to one of Pam Swaddling's old sites, and we dug a 1.5 meter test pit. Had human remains in it, which we're getting DNA on, but that goes back to 2100. And that pottery we've never seen before. It's just completely new. The decoration's just unheard of. So there's so much we don't know. As far as Micronesia is concerned, and there's been a lot of work on DNA as well on Micronesia, the argument is that the Central Caroline Islands, Ponape and whatever, were populated from Vanuatu, the Solomons, coming up into Ponape, 𝘗𝘗𝘅 Ponape. We have pottery in 𝘗𝘅 and Ponape going back 23, 24. In fact, where Nan Madol is, underneath Nan Madol, there's a site of pottery, plainware pottery, which would not be, it's 𝘊𝘱𝘐 plainware pottery at 2223. This was dug by Steve Athens years ago. We know that Piper methisticum carver, through DNA work, originated around the Vanuatu level, and this is common in 𝘗𝘅 and 𝘗𝘆𝑚𝑜𝘅𝑖𝑛𝑔𝑖, coming up from the south to the north. And DNA has shown that indeed the populations of the Carolines and linguistically Micronesian was derivative from lepida. The Western Pacific, Palau, and Yap as a Proto-Malaysian language is different. And it probably came from the Philippines, the same as lepida, but has a different entry point. Now, I'm not saying there wasn't any subsequent movement of people, but linguistically, there are two examples of one coming across from the Philippines, one coming up from Vanuatu. So there is evidence of lepida penetrating up into Ponape and, well, lepida or post-lepida up into Ponape and 𝘗𝘅, and probably even seen around the ᴑ𴑢 area. But what's interesting about this is that this is based on pottery, archaeology, and DNA. But if you look at people today, you look at the islands in southern Palau, for instance, and off the north coast of New Guinea, of West Papua, some of them spoke a Micronesian language. West of Manus, you've got a Micronesian area there, Naningo and other areas. And indeed, some of the southern Palau Islands spoke, I think, a Micronesian language. But these are very fragile areas with tsunamis, I think, wiping out a couple of the islands. Then they're repopulated afterwards. But I find the whole area interesting. But yeah, Austronesian movement, lepida, 𝘗𝘅, Ponape, kava drinking, 𝘗𝘅, Ponape. I actually tried the kava from Ponape when I was there in 2004. I'm not a big kava drinker, but I do it for custom ceremonies. Stupidly, I do it. It's absorbed through the stomach. And the kava from Ponape, I had it after a meal. Normally, you drink it without a meal, right? Because it has more effect. It's a narcotic. But I had kava after a meal, and I said to the chief, I've already eaten. It's a waste of time. He said, try this kava. Well, I tell you what, they had to pick me off the ground. I said, never again will I drink kava from Ponape. But it all came from Vanuatu. We have kava in Manus and kava in Madang, and it's been argued that there's this interaction occurring between Micronesia and Madang and Manus. But again, we don't have much archaeological evidence, and it's pre-oral history. So I find it fascinating, the distribution of plants around the Pacific and what it can tell us about interactions occurring.
Thank you. Ruly, Glenn, he was the one who analyzed my pottery for my PhD thesis.
Wow. And Bu Karina is my professor in my university when I was doing bachelor. Professor Glenn.
Small word.
It is. Well,
and she's teaching, I remember she's teaching about prehistory Oceania and Australia. when I was doing my bachelor degree. Thank you very much, Bu Karina. Sehat-sehat selalu.
I'm looking forward, by the way, to the next IPA conference, Indo-Pacific
yes.
History
Ah, right.
Conference.
Yeah, it's in Jogja.
Yeah.
Are you coming?
Yeah.
It's in Jogja.
Yeah, I'm
That's
coming
great.
to that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I've never been to Indonesia, so it's the only time I can get there. So I'll definitely be there.
And don't forget
Right.
also in 2025 there will be another conference UISPP for protohistory and prehistory studies in also in Java, Professor Glenn. Thank you
Wow.
very much.
I better look into that too.
Yes. We will send you email for the invitation, Professor Glenn.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bu Karina. Ada lagi kira-kira yang ingin ditanyakan? Is there anything, or you want to give a comment on what Professor Glenn said?
No, it's enough.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bu Karina. And I just wondering, this is maybe a really it's just bothering me during this talk show about the background, Professor Glenn, the background for the Lapita people to expand their territory, to expand their habitation across the Pacific. What can you have? Do you have any suggestion on what kind of background push them?
Well, I have ideas, but it's it's a $60,000 question. This one. Let's have a look at what it's not. It's not a population expansion because of overpopulation. In the Pacific, you can put every person in the Pacific, excluding American Hawaii, but all native Pacific Islanders, you could put them into New Caledonia and they'd be very happy together. The Pacific is not a big place. Papua New Guinea is a big place, 10 million people, twice the size of New Zealand in population. But the rest of the Pacific all put together, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, indigenous Hawaii, all of those could all live in New Caledonia quite happily without being overpopulated. So it's not a population issue. I don't think it's an agricultural issue. I think it is an issue about social expansion. And the best example is if you take a Polynesian example of hereditary chieftains. And I do think that these people were hereditary chieftains. But, say you got Dad's the chief. He has 3 sons. The first son inherits the chieftain. The second son can become a dual priest. So you have this dualism within society. The third son, he's going to be trouble. If I was the first son and second son, I'd be looking behind my back. That third son is going to be big trouble. So there's a lot of pressure on the third and fourth son to move out and to find their own niche, their own society. That's the only thing I can think of to explain the rapid movement of people over, thousands of kilometers, in such a short period of time. The second thing is that unless it was part of their culture, like the Baiju in Southeast Asia, it was a part of their culture of living off the actual sea and moving to different islands. And, if you've been to an island, a virgin island where no one had ever lived before, and you get your stone axe or your shell axe and you cut the trees down, that can take ages to plant your first gardens and then wait until the gardens grow that you can actually eat the fruits of your labor. In the meantime, to survive, you overexploit the reefs. So the initial occupation, you're overexploiting the large shellfish, and over time they become smaller in size because you've overexploited. Then you move to another island. So islands can be used as a bit like a small bank that you set up your shop, but it's going to take a while to survive. So you move around the landscape. But the third thing that's important, and I teach my students this, you can move around the landscape. How many people are we talking about? I don't think we're talking about very many. But to survive as a population, I tell my students, get an introductory textbook to Biology 101, because when you move around the Pacific, and you're moving with different canoes, with different peoples speaking a common language, then you'd have to have a next generation. And that next generation is a boy and a girl. And they're probably from other canoes or other communities. So you must have strong social ties that have those marriage partners to ensure and future generations occurring. So it's quite complex. And I think that with a chiefly society, with groups of people speaking similar languages, I'm not talking about thousands of people, but I'm talking about small groups of people who can be interacting. We know that people from the Bismarck Archipelago are getting obsidian to Fiji over 3,000 kilometers away. And these aren't the early occupiers. The obsidian's going over a long period of time. So we know that they're still interacting with each other. We know lapita pottery changes between the Bismarck Archipelago and Tonga and Samoa at the same rate, and Fiji, at the same rate over 300 or 400 years. Now, the pottery is all being made locally. So if the pottery is not moving, the people are moving. The people are interacting between New Guinea across to Tonga and Samoa. Then all of a sudden, after 300 or 400 years, the elastic band breaks and they start to have a population that they can founder and live on. So I do think it's social, and I think it's the social relationships that keeps the society together over 5,000 kilometers of interaction. And I think it is very complex. And that's my 2 bobs worth. And whether it's real or not, I don't know. But I don't think it's population pressure. They're not over-exploiting the islands. Because again, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, you think Samoa, Upolu and Samoa, you know, that's why they're in Samoa for 1,000 years before they move off into the east. These areas can sustain very large populations. That's my guess.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really, it's really fascinating discussion about the background, because I always wondering, and what I read from Pak Daud Aristanudirjo also interest about this topic, and he said that maybe it's the root of capitalism. About I don't know, what do you think about that? When the Austronesian introduced the domestication of animal husbandry and then also plant domestication, they will need the land, and it's the beginning of capitalism.
Well, they went with them in the canoes, pig, dog, chicken, even the rat. But not only that, artocarpus, yam, taro, all their, well, pretty much their whole supply of food came with them. The largest mammal in remote Oceania was the flying fox. All the rest, which is a bat, all the rest was brought with people, and they did need areas and to look after them, and particularly with pigs. Dogs you can let loose. Pigs they were valuable items. I just want to say, if you look at Europe, for instance, in Neolithic Europe, when you look at the settlements, the spread of the Neolithic up the Rhine into Europe itself, when you lived in a house, in heavily populated areas, when you lived in the house with your pigs, your dogs, your cattle, because they were valuable. They were your livelihood. They were extremely valuable. With lapita settlers, I don't know, because they all knew each other. Over time, I think then when you have competition over land and resources, it may be different. But I can't answer your question because I don't know. But I do know that it's a fascinating question that can open up trust down to us that can open up a lot of good discussion.
Yes, thank you very much. So, tidak terasa, so I just realized that we are entering our last session for the discussion, and then it's time for the concluding remarks that will be given by Dr. Marlin Tolla about our previous discussion, and then also her comments on our discussion. Thank you very much, Professor Glenn and Dr. Marlin Tolla. I invite you to present your concluding remarks, please.
Thank you, Ruly. As we come to the end of our session, on behalf of the CPAS board, I would like to thank each of you for joining us today in this insightful discussion on understanding the Austronesian present on mainland Papua New Guinea. And Professor Glenn has highlighted the remarkable evidence of Austronesian culture through Lapita pottery, and which also emerged in our discussion. And this is not only depends in the understanding of this Austronesian influence, also underscores the credible diversity and resilience of the communities in New Guinea and in the Pacific. As we know, the island of New Guinea is well recognized as a global hotspot of cultural diversity, and where the influence of Austronesian speakers continues to shape its people, culture, and environment until today. And also, it has become increasingly clear that the past few millennia have played a significant role in the diversification of unique and yet often interconnected between the cultural identities, and also particularly after the arrival of Austronesian groups in Guinea from the Bismarck Island and the surrounding area. As we conclude, we would like to extend our sincere gratitude and admiration to Professor Glenn Summerhayes for his contribution to Papua New Guinea archaeology in Pacific and even in Southeast Asia. Just to let you know, Prof, I'm working alongside one of your former students, Dylan Gaffney in Raja Ampat. And Dylan frequently mentioned your name during his fieldwork, and describing that you have not only achieved great success in archaeological fieldwork in Papua New Guinea and the surrounding Pacific area, but also how you cultivate deep and build relationships, as we see together, saw together in why you built this soccer and other things. This is really quite interesting to see, and it's mean that you are earning respect of New Guinea that actually they really need to apply when you're working in this island. And I totally agree with what you're doing, and because we need to put our heart, and also when you're working in New Guinea, I always touching when I'm talking about people here. So, yeah. So yeah. So what exactly Dylan did at this moment? Exactly what maybe he's mirroring from you. And so as we begin our journey as researchers in Western New Guinea, we recognize that significant challenge we face in this region, but we are confident that through ongoing research, archaeological research in this area, and application of methods, and also with passion and love, more and more evidence will emerge from this Western part. And it's expected that will be revealed more influence, and especially for Austronesian part, to linking the Papua, as we know that Papua is maybe for administration stuff, being divided by two at this moment, Papua, West Papua, and New Guinea. But as a culture, they are, and genetic and other things, they are bounded together. So that's all that I want to say. Thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you at the next CPAS webinar. Jika ada yang perlu mungkin ditanyakan mengenai topik arkeologi, terutama yang berkaitan dengan Austronesia, mungkin bisa menghubungi Profesor Truman, and also Mbak Retno, Ruly, Mas Hari, Mbak Devi, dan tim CPAS lainnya. Oke, terima kasih, dan goodbye and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marlin Tolla. Thank you very much, Professor Glenn. I hope you have really nice stay in Kyoto.
Well, I
And
just
good luck.
want to say thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to give a talk. It's great seeing some old friends again, and it's been really good. And Dr. Tolla, thank you for your very kind words. Yeah, I'm a resident of Japan. My wife's Japanese, so I'm here I live here half the year. So then the other half of the year I go back to Dunedin. I never see warm weather. I'm here for winter, then I go back for winter in New Zealand. But it's great to see you all and to meet you. And it's been a wonderful experience here. It's nearly 5 o'clock here in Kyoto, so I'm going to now try and find my wife somewhere in town and do a bit of shopping. But hopefully we'll catch up in Jakarta in the IPA conference.
Yes.
I'll definitely be there, and catch up also with Anggraini and Mahita, who I knew also from Canberra, and Dowd as well. So and it's great seeing Karina Arifin after all these years. It's been really good. But thank you for giving me the opportunity, and it's been a privilege, and I've enjoyed it very, very much. Thank you indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor Glenn. And we arrived to our end of the talk show. Thank you. We are sorry if there is any mistakes when we running our talk show, and we will see you in the other talk show of CPAS for next month. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you very much,
Bye.
Professor Glenn.
Thank you so
Makasih,
much.
Mbak
Thank you.
Marlin.
Yeah.
And
Thank
thank you
you.
for
Thank you,
the
Prof.
participant,
Glenn.
for the YouTube viewers.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.